The biggest mistake you can make is assuming you already know someone's worth. The room fell silent just long enough for every employee to look toward the conference table before the laughter started. Daniel Carter remained seated with both hands folded neatly in front of him, his expression calm despite the dozens of eyes fixed on him. At 62 years old, he had spent nearly 3 decades walking through the glass doors of Westbrook Plaza every weekday before sunrise. He knew every hallway, every maintenance schedule, every security guard by name, and every tiny sound the building made when the temperature changed. To most people in the company, he was simply the quiet facilities manager who always seemed to know how to solve a problem before anyone else noticed it existed. Few people ever asked how he knew so much about the property. Fewer still cared. The company had changed rapidly during the past 2 years after a technology investment firm acquired a controlling interest. Young executives replaced experienced department heads. Bright colors replaced traditional offices. Motivational slogans appeared on every wall. Meetings became longer while conversations became shorter. Words like innovation, disruption, and modernization echoed through every floor until they sounded more important than the people actually doing the work. Daniel watched all of it without complaint. He never argued with anyone. He simply continued showing up every morning carrying the same worn leather notebook he had owned for years. Inside it were handwritten notes that no software could replace. Every inspection, every repair, every contractor, every emergency contact, every hidden utility valve was recorded with careful precision. Some employees joked that the notebook belonged in a museum. Daniel only smiled whenever he heard them. On this particular Tuesday morning, an email marked mandatory executive meeting had appeared in everyone's inbox shortly after 8 o'clock. Nearly 200 employees crowded into the large presentation room overlooking downtown Chicago. Some expected an exciting announcement. Others whispered about possible bonuses after a profitable quarter. Instead, Ryan Brooks stepped confidently onto the stage wearing an expensive navy suit and the effortless smile that had earned him magazine interviews as one of the city's youngest chief executive officers. At 41 years old, Ryan believed speed solved almost every problem. He spoke confidently about the future, artificial intelligence, restructuring, efficiency, and building a company ready for the next generation. Every sentence earned polite applause. Then his tone changed. He looked directly toward Daniel. "Some people helped this company survive the past," Ryan said with a practiced smile. "But survival is different from growth." Several employees shifted uncomfortably. Daniel slowly lifted his eyes. Ryan continued without hesitation. "We have reached a point where experience alone is no longer enough. We need people who can keep pace with today's business, not yesterday's." A few nervous laughs spread across the room. Daniel remained perfectly still. Ryan walked closer to the edge of the stage. "Daniel Carter, would you stand for a moment?" Every head turned. Daniel quietly stood, buttoning the front of his gray blazer with steady hands. Ryan smiled again, this time with unmistakable confidence. "After reviewing operational needs, we have decided to eliminate your position effective immediately. Quite frankly, Daniel, you're simply too old for where this company is going." The silence lasted less than a second before scattered applause mixed with awkward laughter from several younger employees eager to support the new leadership. Someone near the back whispered, "It was only a matter of time." Another quietly muttered, "Finally." Daniel looked across the room without anger or embarrassment. His eyes paused briefly on the reception manager who lowered her head, then on an older security officer whose jaw tightened with visible discomfort. Neither spoke. Ryan folded his hands behind his back as though expecting an emotional reaction. Instead, Daniel gave a small respectful nod. "If that is your decision," he said in a calm voice that carried effortlessly across the room, "I hope it brings you exactly what you are looking for." The unexpected composure seemed to unsettle Ryan for only a fraction of a second before he recovered with another polished smile. "Human resources will help collect your company property, and security will escort you out once you've cleared your desk." Daniel simply replied, "Of course." Without another word, he turned toward the exit, leaving behind a room full of people who believed they had just watched the end of an old man's career, never imagining they had actually witnessed the beginning of a lesson none of them would ever forget. Daniel walked through the conference room doors with the same measured pace he had used every morning for nearly 30 years. Behind him, conversations slowly resumed, first in whispers and then in confident voices as employees convinced themselves they had just witnessed another ordinary corporate decision. By the time he reached the elevator, several phones were already buzzing with private messages. Some people expressed sympathy. Others joked that the company had finally entered a new era. Daniel never looked back. The elevator doors opened with their familiar chime, and he stepped inside beside Marcus Ellis, one of the building's security officers. Marcus had worked there for almost 15 years and had greeted Daniel every weekday before sunrise with the same handshake and cup of black coffee. Today, neither of them reached for a handshake. Marcus stared at the floor before quietly saying, "I am sorry it happened like that." Daniel smiled gently. "None of this is your responsibility." Marcus hesitated before asking, "Do you really want me to escort you?" Daniel gave a small nod. "You have a job to do. Do not make today harder than it already is." The elevator reached the 7th floor where Daniel's office overlooked the loading dock behind the building. It was not a glamorous office. The walls held old blueprints, maintenance schedules, inspection certificates, and framed photographs of employees from company picnics that stretched back more than 20 years. Daniel unlocked the door, switched on the light, and quietly began placing personal belongings into a single cardboard box provided by Human Resources. A framed picture of his late wife. A ceramic coffee mug with a faded company logo. His reading glasses. A small desk clock that had never missed a minute. Finally, he picked up the worn leather notebook that had traveled with him every day for decades. Marcus watched silently. "You carried that thing longer than I have worked here," he said. Daniel smiled. "It has never failed me." As they walked through the office, several employees glanced toward the open doorway before quickly pretending to be busy. A young marketing assistant avoided eye contact entirely. 2 software developers whispered to each other before looking away. Near the break room, someone quietly laughed and said, "Imagine working somewhere 30 years just to get replaced in 5 minutes." Daniel heard every word, but showed no sign of offense. Instead, he continued placing items into the box with the patience of someone packing after a pleasant vacation rather than leaving a career behind. As he stepped into the hallway carrying the box, something unusual happened. Linda Perez from the front reception desk immediately stood up from her chair. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "thank you for everything." Daniel smiled warmly. "Take good care of yourself, Linda." She nodded with watery eyes. A few steps later, the overnight cleaning supervisor, Miguel Santos, stopped pushing his supply cart and extended his hand with genuine respect. "It has been an honor working with you." Daniel shook his hand firmly. "The honor was mine." Even the elderly male clerk paused his deliveries just long enough to remove his cap as Daniel passed. These small gestures puzzled several younger employees watching from nearby cubicles. They had never understood why so many longtime staff members treated Daniel with such quiet admiration. To them, he had only been the maintenance manager. They had never asked why electricians, plumbers, security officers, janitors, receptionists, and delivery drivers all seemed to know him personally. Near the main lobby, Ryan Brooks happened to exit another meeting. He noticed Daniel speaking comfortably with employees from every department and frowned slightly. For a brief moment, Ryan seemed surprised by the obvious affection surrounding a man he had dismissed as outdated. The feeling disappeared almost instantly. He adjusted his jacket and continued walking toward another conference room without saying a word. Daniel reached the revolving front doors where afternoon sunlight reflected across the polished marble floor. Marcus held the door open. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. Daniel nodded. "After everything that happened today, why are you so calm?" Daniel looked up toward the top of the 40-story building, his eyes lingering for just a second longer than expected before answering. "Because sometimes people reveal far more about themselves than they realize." Marcus followed Daniel's gaze but saw nothing except rows of reflective windows shining against the blue Chicago sky. Daniel thanked him with another quiet smile, stepped onto the sidewalk carrying only a single cardboard box, and paused beside the entrance. Instead of walking toward the parking garage, he reached into his pocket, removed an old silver phone that very few people had ever seen him use, and calmly dialed a number from memory. The call was answered before the first ring had fully ended. Daniel spoke only one sentence. "Please let everyone know that I am ready for the meeting upstairs." He ended the call, placed the phone back into his pocket, and walked away at an unhurried pace while, several floors above him, Executive assistants across the building suddenly began receiving unexpected instructions that would change the rest of the day completely. Daniel did not head toward the parking garage. Instead, he crossed the street to a small neighborhood coffee shop where he had quietly eaten breakfast every Wednesday for nearly 20 years. The young cashier greeted him with the same warm smile she always used. "The usual, Mr. Carter?" He nodded. "Please." She handed him a cup of black coffee without asking for payment. "Someone already covered it this morning," she said. Daniel smiled politely, but never asked who. He chose the table beside the front window where he could see Westbrook Plaza standing proudly across the street. From the outside, the 40-story tower looked exactly as it had that morning, confident and untouchable beneath the bright Chicago sky. Inside, however, something had already begun to change. On the executive floor, Ryan Brooks had barely returned to his office when his executive assistant appeared at the doorway with an uncertain expression. "Ryan, I just received an unusual request." He continued reviewing financial reports without looking up. "From who?" "It does not say. It only says there will be a mandatory executive meeting in the penthouse boardroom at 2 o'clock. Ryan frowned. "I did not schedule another meeting. Neither did anyone else." She placed the printed email on his desk. The sender field displayed only a secure internal management address that almost nobody in the company had permission to use. Ryan looked at it for several seconds before shrugging. Probably something from the property management company or the ownership group. He returned to his paperwork, giving the message little thought. Throughout the afternoon, similar notifications quietly appeared in executive inboxes across multiple departments. The chief financial officer received one. The legal department received another. Human resources was instructed to attend immediately. Even outside consultants who happened to be working inside the building were unexpectedly invited. Nobody seemed to know who had organized the meeting, yet nobody questioned the authority behind it. Meanwhile, rumors about Daniel spread rapidly through the office. Some employees insisted he had already left the city. Others claimed he had argued with Ryan after leaving the conference room. Neither story was true. Linda Perez quietly listened to the gossip before finally saying, "None of you really knew him." A young analyst laughed. "He was just the maintenance guy?" Linda slowly looked up from her desk. "No, that is just what you thought he was." Before anyone could ask what she meant, the phone rang again, ending the conversation. Across the hall, Marcus Ellis found himself replaying Daniel's final words over and over. "Sometimes people reveal far more about themselves than they realize." The sentence seemed simple, yet something about Daniel's confidence continued bothering him. Marcus had escorted hundreds of terminated employees out of the building over the years. Some cried, some argued, some threatened lawsuits, some begged for another chance. Daniel had done none of those things. It was almost as if losing his job had never truly mattered to him. Back at the coffee shop, Daniel opened his leather notebook one final time. Instead of maintenance records, a folded envelope rested inside the back cover. He carefully removed it and checked the contents. Every document was neatly organized. After confirming everything was present, he closed the notebook and finished his coffee. His phone vibrated softly. A single text message appeared on the screen. "Everything is prepared. Everyone has arrived." Daniel typed only 2 words in reply. "Thank you." He stood, placed a generous tip beneath his empty cup, and walked back toward Westbrook Plaza. As he approached the entrance, several employees inside noticed him through the glass doors. One whispered in confusion, "Why is he coming back?" Another assumed he had forgotten something in his office. Daniel entered the lobby with the same relaxed expression he had worn all morning. Linda looked up from the reception desk, and although dozens of curious eyes watched from nearby workstations, she smiled naturally and said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter." Daniel returned the greeting with an appreciative nod. Instead of walking toward the employee elevators that required company identification, he continued directly toward a separate elevator located behind polished brass doors near the marble lobby wall. Few employees had ever seen anyone use it. A discreet plaque beside the entrance read "Private Access." Before Daniel could reach the call button, an elderly concierge in a tailored dark suit stepped forward immediately. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter," he said respectfully while unlocking the elevator with a special access key. "Everyone is waiting upstairs." The surrounding conversation stopped instantly. Several employees stared in complete silence as the private elevator doors opened. Daniel stepped inside without saying another word. Just before the doors closed, he glanced once toward the crowded lobby where puzzled faces watched him disappear upward, leaving behind a question that no one inside the building could yet answer. The private elevator climbed silently past floor after floor, while Daniel stood alone with his hands resting lightly on the worn leather notebook. There was no sign of anxiety on his face, only the quiet patience of a man who had waited a long time for the right moment to arrive. The elevator finally stopped on the top floor where the doors opened into an elegant reception area that very few employees had ever seen. Thick carpeting softened every step. Original artwork lined the walls. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Chicago skyline stretching for miles beneath the afternoon sun. A woman in a charcoal business suit immediately approached him with a welcoming smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter. Everyone is assembled in the boardroom." Daniel nodded politely. "Thank you, Emily." She walked beside him through the wide hallway. "The legal documents have been reviewed twice. The financial reports are ready." The property management representatives arrived 15 minutes early. Daniel simply replied, "Excellent." Inside the executive offices, several senior managers waited outside the penthouse boardroom, exchanging confused looks. None of them had ever attended a meeting called without Ryan Brooks or the corporate headquarters approving it first. The chief financial officer quietly asked the company attorney, "Do you know what this is about?" The attorney shook his head. "No idea. But whoever called this meeting has authority that outranks all of us." Ryan arrived moments later, still carrying his tablet and coffee. "Has anyone figured out who organized this?" No one answered. Instead, they all noticed the conference room doors remained closed even though the scheduled time had already arrived. Ryan frowned impatiently. "This is ridiculous." Before anyone could respond, Emily stepped into the hallway. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. You may enter now." Ryan confidently walked through the doors first, expecting to find representatives from the property ownership group or perhaps new investors. Instead, he immediately stopped walking. The room was unlike any corporate meeting he had attended before. Along one side of the table sat attorneys from one of Chicago's most respected law firms. Opposite them were accountants, commercial real estate advisors, and representatives from the building management company. Every seat appeared occupied except one. At the far end of the long walnut conference table, facing the entrance beneath the city skyline, sat Daniel Carter. He was no longer carrying the cardboard box from earlier. His gray blazer rested neatly across the back of his chair, and the familiar leather notebook lay closed beside a stack of professionally bound documents. He looked exactly as he always had, calm, composed, and quietly attentive. Ryan blinked once, convinced he had entered the wrong room. "Daniel," he said instinctively. Daniel acknowledged him with a courteous nod, but did not stand. Emily spoke with practiced professionalism. "Mr. Brooks, please take your assigned seat." Ryan glanced around the room. Several executives wore expressions of complete confusion. Others looked equally stunned by Daniel's presence. No one understood why the man who had been escorted out of the building less than 2 hours earlier was now seated at the head of the most important conference table in the tower. Ryan slowly sat down, forcing a polite smile. "I am sorry, but I believe there has been some misunderstanding." Before anyone else could speak, the senior attorney adjusted his glasses and opened a thick presentation folder. "There has been no misunderstanding, Mr. Brooks. This meeting was requested by our client." Ryan looked toward Daniel again. "Your client?" The attorney nodded. "Yes." Ryan laughed nervously. "Daniel is no longer employed here." The attorney's expression never changed. "His employment status is unrelated to today's agenda." An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. The chief financial officer exchanged nervous glances with human resources. The property management director quietly folded his hands as though he already knew exactly what was about to happen. Daniel remained completely silent, allowing the room to grow heavier with every passing second. Ryan leaned back in his chair, trying to regain control. "Perhaps someone should explain why we are here." The attorney closed the folder before speaking with careful precision. "We will. But before we begin, I would encourage everyone present to remember that assumptions often become the most expensive mistakes in business." Several executives shifted uneasily. Ryan forced another smile, although it looked noticeably less confident than it had only hours earlier. For the first time since dismissing Daniel that morning, He felt something he had not expected to experience inside his own headquarters. He felt completely unprepared. The senior attorney allowed the silence to linger just long enough for every executive to become visibly uncomfortable before opening the first binder. His voice remained calm and measured, carrying the confidence of someone presenting facts rather than opinions. For the official record, this meeting concerns the ownership structure of Westbrook Plaza, the existing commercial lease agreement, and several management decisions made earlier today. Ryan folded his arms. I still do not understand why my former facilities manager is sitting at the head of this table. The attorney looked directly at him. You will understand shortly. He turned one page. Before discussing today's events, we must establish several facts. A large monitor at the front of the room illuminated with scanned legal documents, property maps, and corporate filings. Westbrook Plaza was purchased 28 years ago by Carter Family Holdings through a long-term commercial real estate trust. Since then, ownership has remained unchanged. Ryan glanced toward the chief financial officer. We lease from Carter Family Holdings. The chief financial officer looked puzzled. That is apparently correct. The attorney continued. The trust has remained intentionally private, managed through legal representatives, which is entirely common for commercial investment portfolios. Ryan leaned forward. What does that have to do with Daniel? The attorney calmly turned another page without answering immediately. Every second increased the tension around the room. Daniel remained completely silent, watching the discussion unfold with the same composed expression he had carried all day. Finally, the attorney placed a single certified document in the center of the table. This is the current trust agreement, updated 3 years ago. He slid the document toward Ryan. Please read the highlighted section. Ryan reluctantly picked it up. His eyes moved across the page once. Then again, his confident expression disappeared almost instantly. The room remained silent as everyone watched him continue reading. The attorney finally spoke. Would you like me to read it aloud for the record? Ryan did not respond. Very well. The attorney adjusted his glasses. The sole acting trustee, majority beneficiary, and final decision-making authority for Carter Family Holdings is Mr. Daniel Carter. The words settled over the room like an unexpected storm. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the air seemed heavier. The human resources director slowly turned toward Daniel with disbelief written across her face. The chief financial officer quietly lowered his pen. Ryan looked from the document to Daniel several times, searching for some indication that this was an elaborate misunderstanding. No, he finally said. That cannot be right. The attorney slid several additional documents across the polished table. County property records, federal tax filings, commercial ownership registrations, insurance certifications, all verified and publicly recorded. One by one, the executives examined the paperwork. Every signature matched. Every filing was authentic. Every legal record pointed to the same conclusion. Daniel Carter had never simply worked inside the building. He had owned it all along. Ryan slowly leaned back in his chair, his face noticeably pale. If you own the building. He struggled to finish the sentence. Daniel answered for the first time since entering the room. The company leased office space. I accepted the arrangement because I believed in the people working here. His voice remained gentle, almost conversational. There was no anger, no satisfaction, no desire to embarrass anyone. That calmness somehow made the revelation even more overwhelming. Ryan looked genuinely confused. Then why would you spend decades working as facilities manager? Daniel folded his hands on the table. Because I wanted to understand every part of the business from the ground up. A building is more than concrete and steel. It is the people who unlock the doors before sunrise, greet visitors with kindness, clean offices after everyone goes home, repair what breaks, and solve problems before anyone notices them. I wanted to know those people personally. Several employees around the table quietly lowered their eyes. Daniel continued. Titles have never impressed me. Character always has. The attorney resumed speaking. There is one final matter requiring immediate attention. He opened another folder labeled Commercial Lease Review. Earlier today, Mr. Brooks publicly terminated Mr. Carter's employment while acting as chief executive officer of the tenant organization. Ryan swallowed hard but said nothing. That action, by itself, does not violate the lease agreement. However, The circumstances surrounding today's decision have prompted our client to conduct an immediate review of the existing business relationship. Every executive exchanged nervous looks. The chief financial officer slowly closed his laptop, suddenly realizing this meeting had never been about Daniel losing his position. It had always been about whether the company deserved to remain inside the building at all. Ryan stared silently across the table at the man he had dismissed only hours earlier, finally understanding that the balance of power had shifted long before he had ever entered the room. Ryan Brooks had built his career on confidence. Investors admired it. Employees followed it. Competitors respected it. Yet for the first time in years, confidence abandoned him completely. He slowly placed the legal documents back onto the conference table as though they had suddenly become far heavier than paper should ever feel. His voice was quieter now. "Mr. Carter, I was not aware of any of this." Daniel answered without hesitation. "I know." Ryan searched Daniel's face for anger, resentment, or even satisfaction. He found none. That unsettled him more than any accusation could have. The attorney calmly resumed the presentation. "Our client has requested a complete review of the tenant relationship based on today's events, specifically concerning executive judgment, organizational culture, and leadership practices that may affect the long-term value and reputation of this property." The chief financial officer immediately leaned forward. "Is the lease being terminated?" The attorney folded his hands. "No decision has been finalized." A wave of quiet relief passed through several executives before he continued. "However, renewal options scheduled for next year have been suspended pending review." The relief disappeared instantly. Everyone in the room understood what those words meant. Without a renewal, relocating hundreds of employees, relocating specialized equipment, and rebuilding client operations could cost tens of millions of dollars. Ryan finally spoke again. "Surely we can discuss this reasonably." Daniel looked at him with the same calm expression he had shown throughout the day. "That is exactly why everyone is here." Ryan cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology." Daniel remained silent. Ryan continued, choosing each word carefully. "What happened this morning should have been handled differently." Daniel asked a simple question. "Differently because you discovered who I am, or differently because it was wrong?" The room became perfectly still. Ryan opened his mouth, but no answer came immediately. Every executive around the table understood there was only one correct response, yet none believed it would erase what had already happened. After several long seconds, Ryan lowered his eyes. "It was wrong." Daniel gave a slight nod. "That answer came much faster than the one you gave this morning." Nobody attempted to interrupt. Daniel was not humiliating Ryan. His tone remained respectful. That made every sentence impossible to dismiss as revenge. Daniel rested one hand on the leather notebook. "When I accepted the facility's position all those years ago, I never told anyone who I was because I wanted honesty. I wanted people to treat me the same way they treated everyone else. Some did. Some did not." He looked briefly toward the human resources director. "Do you know who consistently greeted me every morning?" She quietly shook her head. "The reception staff, security, cleaning crews, delivery drivers, maintenance contractors, the people whose names rarely appear in company newsletters." He paused before continuing. "Many executives never learn my name even after years of walking past me." Ryan listened without speaking. Daniel continued. "Leadership is revealed by how you treat people who appear unable to change your future." Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The attorney opened another folder containing employee satisfaction reports and internal culture surveys collected over the previous 3 years. "Our review indicates increasing complaints regarding respect, communication, and executive behavior. Today's incident is not viewed in isolation. It reflects a broader pattern requiring immediate attention." The chief financial officer slowly removed his glasses. Until that moment, he had assumed the meeting centered entirely on Daniel. Now he realized it concerned the entire direction of the company. Ryan leaned forward once more. "What happens now?" Daniel answered with complete sincerity. "That depends on what kind of organization you truly want to become." Ryan looked genuinely confused. "You still want to work with us after everything that happened?" Daniel smiled faintly. "I have never been interested in winning arguments. I have always been interested in building something worth preserving." Those words surprised everyone in the room. Several executives had expected demands, threats, or immediate punishment. Instead, Daniel spoke only about responsibility. He looked around the table, making eye contact with each department head before finishing. Every person inside this building deserves to be measured by integrity, effort, and character. Age, job title, appearance, or salary should never decide whether someone receives basic respect. The silence that followed felt different from the silence earlier that day. It no longer came from confusion. It came from reflection. Ryan slowly nodded, understanding that the greatest mistake he had made was not firing an older employee. His greatest mistake had been believing another person's value could be measured by the title printed beneath a company identification badge. No one spoke for several long seconds after Daniel finished. The view outside the floor-to-ceiling windows remained unchanged, but inside the boardroom the atmosphere had shifted completely. The confidence that had filled the room only hours earlier had been replaced by quiet reflection. Ryan Brooks slowly exhaled before standing from his chair. This time there was no polished executive performance, no rehearsed corporate language, and no attempt to control the room. He simply looked directly at Daniel. "I cannot change what happened this morning," he said, "but I would like the opportunity to begin correcting it." Daniel remained seated. "How?" Ryan paused. Earlier that day, he would have answered with a presentation, a restructuring plan, or a carefully crafted statement. Now he realized none of those things mattered. By accepting responsibility instead of looking for excuses, Daniel gave a small nod but said nothing. Ryan continued, "I judged someone based on age instead of contribution. I assumed I understood the people working in this building without truly knowing them. That failure belongs to me." The human resources director quietly leaned forward. "Mr. Carter, if I may speak." Daniel gestured politely for her to continue. "I reviewed the termination paperwork this morning because I trusted executive leadership. Looking back now, I realize I should have challenged the decision instead of simply processing it." Daniel looked at her kindly. Leadership is not limited to the people with the highest titles. Every person has a responsibility to question decisions that do not feel right. She lowered her eyes and slowly nodded. The chief financial officer spoke next. "We focused so heavily on quarterly performance that we stopped paying attention to the culture inside the company. We measured productivity, but rarely measured respect." Daniel folded his hands. "That is a common mistake. Numbers tell you how a business is performing. Character tells you whether it deserves to succeed." The attorney quietly closed the legal binders, sensing that the meeting had moved beyond contracts. Daniel looked around the table once more. "I have no interest in embarrassing anyone. Public humiliation teaches very little. Honest accountability teaches much more." Ryan nodded immediately. "Then allow us to be accountable." Daniel stood for the first time since the meeting had begun. Every executive instinctively stood with him. He walked slowly toward the windows overlooking the city below. "When my father purchased this building almost 3 decades ago, he told me something I have never forgotten." The room remained completely silent. He said that buildings are easy to buy. Communities are much harder to build. Daniel looked down at the busy streets where thousands of people hurried through their ordinary afternoons. "For years I worked downstairs because I wanted to understand the people inside these walls. I learned that the receptionist who smiles every morning can change a visitor's entire experience. I learned that a security officer can calm someone during an emergency. I learned that the maintenance crew notices problems long before executives ever hear about them. Every person contributes something important, even when no one is watching." Ryan quietly replied, "I forgot that." Daniel turned toward him. "Then remember it starting today." He walked back to the conference table and opened his leather notebook for the final time. Several handwritten pages filled with names appeared inside. Ryan noticed that many names belonged to receptionists, janitors, electricians, and administrative assistants rather than executives. Daniel smiled gently. "These are the people who made this building successful every single day. Most never expected recognition. They simply came to work and did their jobs with pride." He carefully closed the notebook. "If this company is willing to rebuild its culture with that same attitude, then I believe it deserves an opportunity to continue growing here." Relief quietly spread across several faces, but Daniel raised one hand before anyone could celebrate. "Do not misunderstand me. Trust is not restored with one conversation. It is restored through consistent actions over time." Ryan nodded without hesitation. "Then we will earn it." Daniel extended his hand across the table. Ryan looked at it for only a moment before shaking it firmly. There were no photographers, no press releases, and no applause. The handshake represented something far more valuable than public relations. It represented a decision to replace pride with humility and assumptions with understanding. As the meeting finally came to an end, every executive left the boardroom, carrying far more than legal documents. They carried the uncomfortable realization that the most influential person in the building had never needed an impressive title to prove his worth, and the greatest lesson of the day had been delivered by the one individual they had underestimated the most. The following Monday felt different from any other Monday the employees could remember. Word about the extraordinary meeting had spread through the building over the weekend, although nobody outside the executive team knew every detail. Rumors traveled from one department to another. Some believed the company had nearly lost its lease. Others claimed the building had been sold overnight. A few insisted Daniel Carter had secretly been a billionaire for years. None of those stories captured the truth. At precisely 8 o'clock, every employee received an invitation to an all-company meeting in the same conference room where Daniel had been dismissed only days earlier. The room filled quickly, but this time the conversations were quieter. Many employees looked toward the entrance, wondering who would appear first. Ryan Brooks walked onto the stage without the confident smile everyone had become accustomed to seeing. He stood silently for several moments before speaking. Before we discuss the future of this company, I need to address something that should never have happened. The room became completely silent. Last week I made a decision that reflected poor judgment, unfair assumptions, and a failure of leadership. I publicly dismissed someone without showing the respect every person deserves. For that, I accept full responsibility. Employees exchanged surprised glances. Public apologies from chief executive officers were almost unheard of. Ryan continued, "This company cannot ask people to trust its leadership unless that leadership is willing to admit when it is wrong." He paused before adding, "Beginning today, we are introducing changes that will affect every level of our organization." Large screens behind him displayed a new initiative called Respect First. Mandatory leadership training would focus on communication, workplace dignity, mentorship, and unbiased decision-making. Anonymous employee feedback would be reviewed directly by an independent committee rather than remaining inside executive offices. Promotion evaluations would include leadership behavior alongside financial performance. Ryan looked across the audience. Results matter, but the way we achieve those results matters just as much. The audience remained quiet, listening more carefully than ever before. Then Ryan stepped aside. Daniel Carter walked onto the stage to complete silence. There was no dramatic music, no spotlight, and no grand introduction. Many employees who had laughed during the previous meeting lowered their eyes in embarrassment. Others simply watched with genuine curiosity. Daniel stood behind the podium for a moment before smiling warmly. "I appreciate everyone being here." His voice remained calm, exactly as it always had. "Many of you have been asking why I chose to spend so many years working inside this building instead of simply managing it from an office somewhere else." He looked around the room. "The answer is simple. I wanted to understand the people whose work gave this place its purpose." He pointed gently toward the reception area outside the conference room. "A visitor forms an opinion about this company within seconds of entering the lobby. That experience begins with the receptionist." He looked toward the maintenance staff seated together near the back. "A safe workplace depends on people who repair problems before anyone notices they exist." Then he smiled toward Marcus Ellis. "Security professionals protect far more than property. They protect peace of mind." Finally, Daniel looked across the executives seated in the front row. "Leadership is not about standing above everyone else. Leadership is about making every person around you feel that their contribution matters." The audience answered with sincere applause, not because Daniel owned the building, but because every employee recognized the truth in his words. After the meeting ended, something unexpected happened throughout the day. Managers stopped by workstations simply to thank employees. Ryan personally visited the maintenance department, shaking hands with technicians whose names he had never previously learned. Human Resources invited suggestions from employees who had rarely spoken during meetings. Linda Perez found a handwritten thank you note waiting on her reception desk acknowledging the professionalism she had demonstrated for years. Marcus Ellis received recognition for outstanding service. Even Miguel Santos and the overnight cleaning crew discovered appreciation letters placed inside their lockers before their evening shift began. None of these gestures erased the mistakes of the past, but they marked the beginning of something different. For the first time in a long while, people throughout the building noticed that respect was no longer being discussed only in conference rooms. It was quietly becoming part of everyday life. 6 months passed, and Westbrook Plaza no longer felt like the same building. The polished marble floors, the glass walls, and the skyline outside had not changed, but the atmosphere inside had transformed in ways that could never be measured on a balance sheet alone. Employees greeted one another by name instead of rushing past with their eyes fixed on their phones. Managers regularly visited departments they had rarely entered before. New executives quickly learned that respect was not considered an optional leadership skill, but an essential expectation. The changes had not happened overnight. They had been built one conversation, one decision, and one act of accountability at a time. Ryan Brooks kept the promise he had made inside the penthouse boardroom. Every month, he met with employees from different departments without assistants or prepared presentations. Sometimes the conversations were uncomfortable. Employees spoke honestly about mistakes that had been ignored for years. Ryan listened instead of defending himself. More importantly, he acted on what he heard. Gradually, trust began returning. It was slower than rebuilding a damaged office or launching a new business strategy, but Daniel had been right. Trust could only be restored through consistent actions. One quiet Friday afternoon, Daniel walked through the lobby carrying his familiar leather notebook. Linda Perez smiled as soon as she saw him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter." Daniel smiled back. "How is everything today?" "Busy," she replied with a laugh. "Exactly the way it should be." Marcus Ellis stepped away from the security desk to shake Daniel's hand. "You were right," he said. "People really can change." Daniel looked around the busy lobby where employees from every department crossed paths without noticing anything unusual about the scene. "Some can," he answered. "The important ones usually do." As Daniel prepared to leave, a young financial analyst hurried toward him. Daniel recognized him immediately as one of the employees who had laughed quietly during the meeting where he had been dismissed months earlier. The young man stopped several feet away, looking genuinely nervous. "Mr. Carter, may I have a minute?" Daniel nodded. "Of course." The young analyst took a slow breath. "I have wanted to apologize for a long time. I judged you without knowing anything about you. I assumed your job defined your value. I was wrong." Daniel studied the young man for a moment before smiling warmly. "What matters is not that you made a mistake. What matters is that you recognized it and decided to become better because of it." The young man nodded with visible relief. "I will not forget that." "Neither will I," Daniel replied. They shook hands, and the young analyst returned to work carrying something far more valuable than forgiveness. He carried a lesson that would shape every future decision he made about the people around him. Daniel slowly walked outside and paused on the front steps of Westbrook Plaza. The afternoon sun reflected across the windows exactly as it had on the day he had carried a cardboard box through those same doors. The difference was not the building. The difference was the people inside it. His phone rang softly. It was the property management director. "Mr. Carter, we have finalized next year's lease renewal documents whenever you are ready." Daniel smiled. "Send them over on Monday." "Any additional conditions?" Daniel looked back toward the entrance where Ryan was holding the door open for a maintenance technician pushing a heavy equipment cart. Ryan waited patiently until the technician had passed before following behind him. Daniel quietly watched the simple gesture. Months earlier, it never would have happened. "No additional conditions," Daniel answered. "Only one expectation." "What is that?" the director asked. Daniel replied without hesitation. "That everyone who walks through those doors remembers that every person deserves dignity before they earn recognition." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Before leaving, he opened the leather notebook one final time. On the last blank page, he wrote a single sentence in careful handwriting. "Respect always reveals character long before success does." He closed the notebook, smiled to himself, and walked away at the same steady pace that had carried him through countless mornings over nearly 3 decades. Behind him, Westbrook Plaza continued standing proudly against the Chicago skyline, not because it was owned by an extraordinary man, but because one ordinary act of humility had reminded an entire company that the true foundation of every successful workplace is never concrete, steel, or glass. It is the way people choose to treat one another when they believe no one important is watching.